Good evening. On behalf of Mrs. Reagan and the Board of Trustees of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, it's my honor to welcome you this evening to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. My name is Stuart McLaurin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Centennial Celebration. I'd like to extend a very special welcome to our noted and most special guest today, Natan Sharansky, a truly courageous voice in defense of freedom, a man who, like Ronald Reagan, inspired freedom and helped change the world. Natan Sharansky is a man who brought moral clarity to international issues of human rights and reminded us of exactly how precious our freedoms are. I would also like to extend a very special and warm welcome to our friends from Pepperdine University. The relationship of Ronald Reagan with Pepperdine is long, deep, rich, and abiding. And we are honored to partner with Pepperdine today in this centennial celebration event highlighting faith in action through two men whose lives are icons of faith, Ronald Reagan and Natan Sharansky. Most of you know that this year, 2011, began on a cool, early morning hours of January the 1st when the Ronald Reagan-themed float went down Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena, California for the 2011 Tournament of Roses parade. Since that day, we've had many exciting and inspiring centennial events that have taken place across the country and around the world, including academic symposia such as the one here today with Pepperdine that have taken place with great universities such as the University of Virginia, the University of Southern California, Notre Dame, the United States Naval Academy, and Georgetown University. We've also been privileged to partner with friends around the world with celebrations that have taken place in European capitals, with statue unveilings, also academic symposia, and celebratory events internationally. Also New York, Washington, and events across the nation in cities small and large, from the president's hometown of in Dixon and Tampico in Illinois, as well as at his alma mater of Eureka College. As Ronald Reagan began his career as a radio sports broadcaster, it's also been fitting that during this centennial year, we've had a number of sports-related centennial activities. 11 Major League Baseball teams have celebrated President Reagan at ballparks across America this year. We have had a Ronald Reagan-themed NASCAR, which will actually run in a race in Kansas on October the 9th, a Reagan-emblazoned Indy car that actually won the 100th running of the Indianapolis 500 this year. And incidentally, you can see those two cars only one time and one place, and that's at this library through the middle of next month. We have those two cars on display in a very special exhibit. We also were privileged to have the NFL and the Super Bowl recognize President Reagan on his actual birthday, February the 6th in Dallas, Texas. And we had a partnership with the PGA Tour at the LA Open. And next week, a very fun and we think unique and historic event will take place where at 14,000 high schools across the United States, we have asked them to toss this Ronald Reagan centennial coin that has been sent to them with academic curriculum. And we have 90 universities across the nation that will toss this coin on Saturday the 24th, and several NFL teams that will do it on Sunday the 25th, and will culminate it in Dallas, Texas at the Cowboys-Redskins game on Monday Night Football when the Ronald Reagan centennial coin will be tossed. So you can see we've had a wide variety of sports and other activities throughout the year. Then last week there was the historic presidential campaign debate among the Republican candidates for President of the United States. And if you've not had the opportunity to visit the newly enhanced, renovated Reagan Library here that reopened on the president's birthday in February, it's a must-do. It's one of the most incredible museum experiences in the country, and certainly among all presidential libraries. Of course, we're biased, but it's also fact. And in case that's not enough activity to wear you out, we have a number of centennial events that are planned throughout the course of the year, all the way up until the president's 101st birthday. And then there's the ongoing plethora of activities, public affairs events, and activities and initiatives that take place through the regular course of the library and foundation's activities. Personally, I've always believed that God brings people into our lives for a reason, for a season, or for a lifetime. But it's clear that the lives of Ronald Reagan and Pepperdine University are entwined beyond a lifetime. And today we are experiencing and we're also enjoying one more episode of that enduring relationship. To begin and continue our program and to introduce our very special guest, it's my privilege to welcome a good friend of mine, an extraordinary leader in American higher education, the Dean of the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University, Dean James R. Wilburn.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you for all being here today. As Stuart mentioned, we have a very special relationship to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Library, and it's one that we try to nurture and honor and appreciate for all that it is certainly due. I know you came here to hear Natan Sharansky, but I do want to express appreciation to a couple of people and groups today who have made this occasion possible. Among them are our good friends at Pepperdine, Diane and Guilford Glazer, who are the founders of the Diane and Guilford Glazer Institute for Jewish Studies at Pepperdine University. Now, you may think that's strange for a university that is called a Christian university to have a Center for Jewish Studies, but we think, since the founder of our religion was a young Jewish rabbi, that it's totally appropriate. Diane and Gil have a very special connection not only to Pepperdine, but also to Ronald Reagan and to our speaker this evening. Mr. Glazer was an activist for the freedom of Jews in the former Soviet Union, advocated to President Reagan to take a leadership role in that liberation. And Mr. Sharansky, whose wife was an advocate for his freedom, often visited with Mr. Glazer during those challenging days. So Diane and Gil, we thank you again for your involvement with Pepperdine and for helping to make this evening possible. I would also add that we have a group called the Dean's Advisory Council of the School of Public Policy, and they make possible something called the Dean's Excellence Fund. We also have here this evening our provost, Daryl Tippins, and he happens to have an excellence fund. And so I've been privileged to tap into both of those made possible by our Board of Visitors and other friends, and I want to acknowledge them and the Glazers for making this possible this evening. Would you join me in expressing appreciation to them? We're especially privileged to be a part of this evening because Stuart and his staff and the whole organization here at the Presidential Foundation have done such an incredible job of stewardship of the legacy of the great President Ronald Reagan. And as Stuart kind of gave just a sampling of all the things they've done this year, I've remembered following that on television from London to Warsaw and from Simi Valley to Washington, D.C., time after time after time, and I don't know how you do it all, Stuart. When I first met Stuart some months ago and he invited us to be a part of this, I had no idea what he was biting off, but it's been, you make it look so easy. I'm sure it's not, but and so we're privileged to be a part of it and humbled by the opportunity. We're especially humbled because in joining with the Presidential Foundation to celebrate the faith of President Reagan, it's a topic that happily is familiar territory that is shared with us at Pepperdine, indeed by Mr. Pepperdine himself. Mr. Pepperdine and Ronald Reagan were from a similar part of the country. They grew up in a religious faith tradition that was similar, had common roots, and I think he knew who Mr. Pepperdine was. At a time when riot police were present to protect then Governor Reagan from angry students on some campuses where he appeared, because he was, by reason of being governor, was a member of the Board of Regents. I happened to be at one of those campuses one day when he was meeting with the regents, and there literally were riot police on campus to keep order. In the midst of those chaotic years of the 1960s, Pepperdine stepped forward and gave him their highest honor, an honorary doctorate degree. I think Eureka may have been ahead of us, but we were early on in the many different such accolades. And he returned often to speak at Pepperdine. In October 1966, when he had just announced to be a candidate for governor, I just recently came across a recording of a speech that he made on the campus of Little Pepperdine College in South Central Los Angeles to a group that some of our friends had assembled called Educators for Reagan, right when he announced that he was going to run for governor. And again, if you can put yourself back into the 60s and what it was like to be on a college campus then, it takes guts to host the Educators for Reagan, which Pepperdine did early on. He returned often to speak at Pepperdine. In October of 1966, having made this announcement. He later came back 5 years later to announce the founding of our plans to build a new campus at Malibu. And he appeared to 2 sold-out ballrooms. We filled, a couple of thousand people filled the ballrooms, both at the Century Plaza and at the Beverly Hilton. We put him in a limousine and had him back and forth to give a speech at both places to announce our plans in what we call the birth of a college evening. Then again, he came to Pepperdine in 1979 he had just been to Europe to meet for the first time with Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl, and came back, and some of his staff came to me and said, you know, the Marshall Plan was announced on a university campus. The Iron Wall speech by Churchill was announced on a university campus, and we'd like to give this speech about international affairs on a university campus. So he came back to Pepperdine. In the immediate time before that, he came to not only dedicate our campus, calling it Seaver College or undergraduate. He came on another occasion with a tree under his arm, a bush, and planted a sequoia tree that's doing very well, thank you, about 30 or 40 feet high. But when he came from his visit with Margaret Thatcher and Helmut Kohl, as I recall, it was January of 1989, or of 1979, he announced this historic speech of his view and his vision for the role that the United States needed to play in the future of global affairs. And then, of course, after the White House in 1989, after he and Nancy came home from the White House, he made his way back once more, coming back home to Malibu, and spoke to our students in their weekly convocation, and was there to receive a gift that our students prepared of a surfboard, which appropriately they designated Surfboard 1. And I understand it's a part of the permanent collection here at the Presidential Library. Our topic today reflects why he felt so close to Pepperdine. Both he and Mr. Pepperdine grew up, as I mentioned, in the heartland of America. Reagan taught Sunday school for 10 years. In high school, even when he went away to college, he drove back 100 miles each way for some Sundays to finish his Sunday school back in his hometown. And so I think it explains partly why he felt so close to little struggling Pepperdine at a very important time in our history. He returned often to quotations from the sacred scriptures that he knew by heart. sometimes penciling into the scripts of speeches that other people had written for him. One such favorite passage from the Hebrew Scriptures was 2 Chronicles 7:14. This is why I knew where it came from today as we paused in front, Mr. Sharansky and Stuart and I. A passage in front of his mother's Bible, in his mother's Bible, on which he placed his hand to take the oath of office as president. And today, as we were wandering through the various displays, we stopped in front of that Bible, and you can read it clearly. This is a favorite passage where he put his hand on the Bible to be sworn in. If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. And his mother, you can still read it in the margin, had written in a most wonderful verse for the healing of the nation. And as we paused there today, I thought we need that very much today in a world that is so torn and a nation so divided, for the healing of the nation. In his autobiography, I did a little research this year, and in rereading his autobiography, he remembered a novel that he said had changed the course of his life, that he read as a teenager, I think 13 or 14 years old. The title of it is That Printer of Udell's. And he said it had a significant impact on his life, so much so that I found a copy of it and read it this past summer. It's not great literature, but it tells how a young man in the Midwest during the Great Depression came into town, this little village in the Midwest, and discovered that organized religion often did not care for those in need as it should. And the story reflects the way in which he turned around the attitude of that little town. It captures the message of the social gospel of the time. And in the end, the young man goes off to Washington, D.C. to serve in Congress. So you can see here's a little 13, 14-year-old young man reading this and still remembering, after he came home from the White House, that this little novel written for teenagers had such an impact on his life. And I think it says a lot about him. I want to mention three specific areas as I introduce our speaker this evening, where I think Reagan's influence on the history cannot be understood to any important degree apart from the significance of his faith. One is his sense that the United States was fortuitously situated in time and geography and circumstance, he believed divinely selected, for a special role in the history of the human race on earth. This notion reflected in many speeches throughout his entire life. I found a number of quotations from 1952 on, but let me read one from toward the end of his life in which he repeats this after he came back from the White House. You may think this a little mystical. You can see him kind of tossing his head, and well, you may think I'm a little mystical in this. You may think this a little mystical, but I've said it many times, and I believe that there was a divine plan to place this great continent here between the two oceans, to be found by peoples from every corner of the earth. I believe we were preordained to carry the torch of freedom for the world. Reagan never tired of referring to the United States as a shining city on a hill, chosen not to be an empire, not an imperial power to exploit others or to take their land, but to provide an example to the world of how men and women can live in liberty. And for any who may think that's a bit corny, he stood in good company from George Washington down to John F. Kennedy. Kennedy said in his inaugural address, as he asked for God's blessing and his help, knowing, he said, quote, that here on earth God's work must be our own, unquote. Second, Reagan came to believe that this sense of mission applied uniquely to his own personal purpose in life. We often forget, when you tour the display here, you'll be reminded, what he and Nancy could never forget, that 2 months after he took office, he almost died from the bullet of an attempted assassination. Fortuitously, the bishop, which was designed to explode in its victim, did not explode, and it lodged about an inch from his heart rather than in his heart. The doctors barely stopped the flow of blood in time, and he was much closer to death than we often remember. While still in the hospital, he told his daughter Maureen that he was convinced that God had spared him from death for a reason, and that he would devote the rest of his time on earth to finish his task. Notably, only 1 month later, he wrote a 4.5-page letter to Leonid Brezhnev. And when experts on Russia raised serious questions about the letter, he told Mike Deaver, since I've been shot, I think I'm going to rely more on my own instincts rather than other people's. There's a reason I have been spared. The draft of that letter, which I think maybe you can see here, and some of the correspondence that came after it, the draft of that letter began a long and historic process in which Reagan often went against his handlers, following his own heart, to build bridges to Russian leaders, and I believe very purposefully, very cagily, very craftily, to develop a strategy that won the Cold War and freed our speaker today from prison without firing a shot or sparing a drop of blood. And then finally, in dissecting Reagan's role in history, a third area that can only be understood in the light of his deep and abiding faith was his lifelong battle with communism and what he believed to be one of the most deadly plagues in history. The world still remembers that day on March 8th in 1983 when relations between the United States and the Soviet Union were virtually at their worst, reminiscent of Winston Churchill's speech 40 years earlier in which he proclaimed that an iron curtain had descended across Europe. Reagan declared that the Soviet Union was the focus of evil in the modern world, an evil empire. It was popular in the press to treat the comment as polarizing and destructive, and I could name some members of the press who sneered at it at the time. We now know that as word of Reagan's evil empire language spread throughout Russia, it gave hope to a growing number of intellectual and spiritual leaders like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whom Reagan read regularly and quoted often, and Natan Sharansky, our speaker this evening, who later told how he, a dissident Jewish prisoner, was able to read his Hebrew scriptures in prison with a friend who was a Christian. They called their Bible readings each day Reaganite readings. So in spite of the American press, many across Russia were given hope in knowing that the American president had the courage to tell the truth. When we began the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine, I had paid a dozen visits to Russia myself, and I was able to arrange for Mikhail Gorbachev to spend an afternoon with my students. We had no press. We didn't even have the president of the university, just my students and Gail, my wife, and Mr. Gorbachev. And one of the things that struck me most as the students asked him questions was the obvious respect that he had for Ronald Reagan. From his first visit to Moscow, Reagan made the case for freedom of religion, insisting on meeting with church leaders, closing his TV address to the whole nation by saying, "God bless you." By the end of his presidency in 1988, 1989, over 2,000 parishes were opened all across Russia. By the time that Gorbachev met with my students at Pepperdine, he was prepared to acknowledge his belief that religious people were worthy of respect. That's his phrase. Today we can know Ronald Reagan more fully, and we can draw strength from him for the challenges that we have been uniquely chosen to face by revisiting, I think, and honoring anew the faith that nourished him, gave him hope, and through him gave hope to peoples of many nations. Perhaps no passage from the sacred scriptures more powerfully captures the faith that nourished Ronald Reagan through some of the most trying and difficult times, then one of his favorite passages that he quoted often from the Hebrew Scriptures, to which he returned often, Isaiah, the 40th chapter and verse 31. And it's with that scripture this afternoon, loved and quoted often by Ronald Reagan, that I am privileged to introduce to you our speaker today. Isaiah, the author of Isaiah, wrote, "They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not grow weary. They shall walk and not faint."
There stands before the entire world one great and inescapable conclusion. Freedom leads to prosperity. Freedom replaces the ancient hatreds among nations with comity and peace. Freedom is the victor.
I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
On March 8, 1983, President Ronald Reagan spoke these words to a gathering of the National Association of Evangelicals in Orlando, Florida. But the message resonated around the world. On that day, Natan Sharansky was well into his 5th year in a Siberian gulag, but Ronald Reagan's message of hope was heard loud and clear by him and his fellow prisoners, held for nothing more than longing for freedom. Born in 1948 in what is now Ukraine, Natan Sharansky studied mathematics in the finest universities and worked as an English interpreter for the great Soviet physicist and dissident Andrei Sakharov. The life he planned as an engineer was soon replaced by a life spent fighting for the rights of Soviet Jews. Israel's surprise victory in the Six-Day War of 1967 led to celebrations by Jews around the world. For Soviet Jews like Sharansky, Israel's triumph brought a new sense of dignity and awakening of their religious traditions. While immigration wasn't technically illegal, few Jews were ever given permission to leave the Soviet Union. In 1973, Sharansky applied for an exit visa to Israel, but was refused on security grounds. He soon found himself at the forefront of a fight on behalf of those other Jews who had also been refused. Soviet leaders, frustrated by the West's focus on human rights and concerned about losing their hold over their population, began cracking down on these refusnik leaders. Many were arrested, Sharansky among them.
I was haunted, I was arrested sometimes, persecuted in different forms.
Convicted in 1978 on false charges of treason and spying on behalf of the United States, Sharansky was sentenced to 13 years imprisonment. This miscarriage of justice transformed what would have been a small solidarity movement into an international campaign to free Soviet Jews. During his years in prison, Sharansky became a symbol for human rights in general and for Soviet Jewry in particular. A campaign for his release was waged tirelessly by his wife, Avital, who had immigrated to Israel the day after their wedding, with the hope that her husband would soon follow. Intense diplomatic efforts and public outcries for his release were unsuccessful. While publicly decrying the evils of the Soviet Union, behind the scenes for more than 5 years, President Reagan worked for Sharansky's release. After first meeting Sharansky's wife, Reagan wrote in his diary, "Those inhuman monsters, I promised I would do everything I could to obtain his release, and I will." True to his word, Reagan imposed personal pressure on Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev through private letters, closing one by writing, "This is between the two of us, and I will not reveal that I made any such request. I'm sure, however, that you understand that such actions on your part would lessen my problems in future negotiations between our two countries." On February 11, 1986, the world awoke to the startling news that Sharansky had been released in a surprise East-West prisoner exchange. He was at long last reunited with his beloved wife and received a hero's welcome in a country he had spent his life trying to reach.
Dear Mr. President, I am under strong stress now, sitting between our Prime Minister and my avatar, and that's why don't be surprised if my speech wouldn't be smooth. But there are some things which I feel myself obliged to tell you. First of all, I know how great was your role in this greatest event of my and my wife's life, and the fact that I could join my people today in Israel. And of course, we both are very deeply grateful to you for this.
In the years that followed, Sharansky led the fight for freedom for Jews and all others oppressed around the globe.
History will judge if the world had enough will and resolve to do what you are doing today, to stand up, to be counted, and to make your voices be heard.
In 1989, after decades of American and Western pressure, led throughout the 80s by President Reagan, the world witnessed another historic moment in the East's struggle for freedom.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
With the emergence of freedom that accompanied the fall of the Soviet Union, Sharansky stepped into a new role, helping Soviet Jews build a political party and participate in a free society for the first time. He would rise to the highest levels of government, serving as minister in 3 Israeli cabinets. In recognition of his life's work, Sharansky received the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of only 4 non-Americans to receive both awards. Today, Natan Sharansky continues to fight for free and open societies. He understands the cost of freedom is high, but he also understands the cause of freedom is great.
There have been men and women who make us gasp with wonder at the greatness thrust upon them when oppression proved too much to tolerate. I think of the sight of Natan Sharansky, still in the dominion of his KGB captors, zigzagging his way across the tarmac after they ordered him to walk a straight line from the plane that had carried him to freedom. It was one of those moments when laughter and tears commingle. Freedom comes in many guises, in the noble words of the Declaration of Independence and in the noble souls of people like Sharansky. And yet, freedom cannot exist alone. The freedom of a man whose cause is just and whose faith is his guiding light.
Dear friends, dear friends, dear friends, dear friends, thank you. When some time ago Christian University asked me to speak about the faith of President Reagan, I thought it's very natural, because from all my experience with President Reagan, it was always clear to me that we are of the same faith. That President Reagan had a deep faith that man is created in the image of God, and that's why every man deserves to be treated as equal, and he deserves to be free. This doesn't make President Reagan unique. There are millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people who share this faith. But the fact that he put this faith, this belief in the power of people who want to be free. He put it as a main cornerstone of his policy towards superpower that makes him absolutely unique in history and that makes him a person who played a unique role in defeating communism and in making our world much better place. And in order to explain why it is so unique, I have no better way but to take you back to Soviet prison, to the day which was mentioned today here at least twice, in the March of 1983. To political Soviet prison Chistopol on the border between Siberia and Europe. Soviet Union was always obsessed with isolation, how to isolate their people from the world, how to jam the radios, how to cut the telephone lines, how to build the borders, miles and miles of electronic equipment and dogs that will not permit free contact between Soviet people and the outer world. But it was also very concerned how to isolate political dissidents from the people, how to isolate their prisons from the Soviet Union. And in prison, the authorities were spending a lot of efforts how to isolate one prisoner from the other. So political prisoners could spend years and years in prison, seeing only one or two cellmates, and sometimes for years, I spent approximately 5 years in solitary confinement, seeing nobody. And the only source of information is official Soviet newspaper, Pravda, which if you are not in a punishing cell, you can read it. So, of course, we tried our best to communicate with one another between the cells, even if it is not permitted. How you're communicating between the cells? The most simple thing is, of course, Morse. That's my name in Russian words. I don't know Morse in English. So. But it is relatively safe. Why? Because you can knock it at the same time to watch and to see that the guard is not near the door. But it's very slow because you're sending one letter. Now I sent you 5 letters, but I'm sure that you are listening to me. But when you're knocking on the wall in the cell, you don't know whether the other guy is standing and listening. Maybe the guard is just near, maybe he's doing something else. So you're sending one letter and you're waiting approval. Then another letter, approval. So to send a phrase, it takes a lot of time. But okay, we have long sentences, so we have time. So that is relatively safe. More dynamic way of communication is with a cup, aluminum cup, you put it, you are using it as a receiver, put it to the wall, speak and listen. It is better, but a little bit more dangerous. By far the most effective way of communication is through the toilets. If you drain it out of the water and put your head deep into these tubes, you can speak like by phone. Definitely better than by mobile phone because there is permanent connection. But of course it is very dangerous because if the God will see you, how you can explain what your head is doing there? So you have to choose always between these two ways. There was one day, in all those 9 years that I was in prison, one day when we forgot or ignored simply all the precautions, all the warnings, when we were talking in spite of the KGB guards shouting on us. We were speaking through toilet and through Morse, sending by Morse. I was sending to my friend who was in the punishing cell, and that's why he could not read the article which I just now read. I was sending to him by Morse this great news. What was the news? Soviet newspaper, Pravda, published an article condemning, in the most extreme terms, condemning President Reagan, who is destroying all the world peace, who is destroying all the harmony, who is doing something which is absolutely inappropriate. He calls Soviet Union evil empire. And in this article, there are quotes from the other speeches, and suddenly it is clear that there is the leader of the free world who says that communism is evil, that communism is something which is against the nature of Soviet people, and that it will disappear very quickly. In order you will understand the level of our excitement, in order you will understand why at that moment we understood that the days of Soviet Union are counted, that finally our dreams and our beliefs are coming from the world of dreams into the reality. I have to explain you what was our struggle. Not our struggle with the Soviet regime, what was our struggle with the free world. What was Soviet Union? Ideologically, from inside, it was the regime based on ideology of equality. All the people have to be equal. But it means that everything what divides people has to be removed. Property. People have different levels of property. So in order to remove this exploitation, we'll take all the property to ourselves. The state confiscate all the property, and now we will decide how we will distribute among the citizens. Now religion is dividing people. There are wars because of religion. So religion, by official definition, was opium. Opium is a kind of narcotic. Opium for the people. So it has to be removed. And it was removed. Nationalism. National differences, that's the tool of capitalists to make people fight with one another and to exploit them. So nationalism is also prohibited. Loyalty in the family. It's something dangerous, because the first loyalty must be to the regime. And so we grew with the great heroes of my Soviet youth, were people who informed about their own parents, because loyalty of the family also has to be destroyed. So everything what makes identity, what makes people feeling themselves part of family, part of community, part of faith, or part of some class with the property, it's all had to be erased. And of course, the nature of the people was resistant to this. But as Lenin said, and he's just also in the museum somewhere it is quoted, that in order to create this great society of equals, if you have to kill some of those who are resisting, that's okay. And they started killing from hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands, millions, tens of millions. Tens of millions of their own people were killed in order this experiment to succeed. And if there were times when there were millions of political prisoners, those who couldn't accept this life without religion, without nationalism, without property, in the times when I was growing, there were already a few thousand political prisoners, because hundreds of millions of people were already controlled by fear. So that is from inside. And it was clear to us that all these so-called loyal Soviet citizens are not loyal, but they are controlled by fear. What was from outside? From outside, here is powerful dictatorship, which controls 1/3 of the world, which has the most powerful weapons, which army went through all the Europe, which is not hesitant to send their tanks to Hungary and to Prague, and missiles to Cuba, and troops to Angola and to Nicaragua, and to Sudan and many other places in the world, and later to Afghanistan, of course. And what can you do? How you treat the gangster with the big stick in his hand, old story says, you call him sir. And that's exactly, you have to treat them with respect. You have to find the way to accommodate their interests and ours. That's the official language of Nixon's administration. And then there was a great word brought by de Gaulle, détente. We have to decrease tension between us and Soviet Union. Of course, they are bad guys. We know they are bad guys. But what to do? But they exist, they go nowhere. We have to deal with them. And that's how this policy of detente, of decreasing the pressure, of treating them as equals, you have your problems, we have our problems, let's find common language. Today it's called engagement. That was called accommodation. We dissidents were furious about it. We felt that not only that it's betrayal of our struggle, but that it's some kind of misconception that Andrei Sakharov, the great leader of human rights, I'm very proud to be his pupil. I would say he was my rabbi, but he was not Jewish, so he was not my rabbi, but he was my teacher. And a great leader, he was explaining again and again that how can you trust to the leaders who don't trust to their own people? It is for your own security that you have to be tough with them, that you have to speak to make human rights part of this equation. But the answer was, and I heard it from the leaders of Nixon Kissinger administration all the time, that, look, you are great guys, we love you, we'll do everything to help you. But what to do? This is different civilization, different mentality, different people. These 200 million people, they all support these leaders. So we have to find a way to be friends of these leaders, and then we will be able to help to you. And at that moment, they almost gave the status of most favored nation and all trade benefits to Soviet Union. In the last moment, there was another great leader, Democratic Senator Jackson, who proposed and passed Jackson Amendment, which said, you want free movement of goods, only together with free movement of people. The countries with non-market economy can get status of most favored nation only if they have freedom of immigration. It was very good, we welcomed it. It was only one episode. And policy in general remained the same. We have to find common language with the Soviet Union. Why? Because it goes nowhere. It exists and will exist forever. What we can do, we don't like it. But we don't decide. The Russian people decided. That is their regime, what they wanted. And really, this hypothesis or belief that Soviet Union is here in this world forever, all Sovietologists in the world shared it. If you look not only in the 70s and the 80s, you look few months before Soviet Union disappeared. None of the Sovietologists was predicting it. And when Soviet Union fell apart, everybody was saying, who could believe that they are so weak from inside? Who could think that they are so weak? How they succeeded to deceive us? My answer is very simple. Go and look what Soviet dissidents were writing, not in the 80s, not in the 70s. In 1969, Andrei Amalrik, Russian dissident writer, wrote a book where the Soviet Union will survive until 1984. He took 84 because of Orwell, of course, but also because from 69 it was 15 years. And there he was explaining that this is the regime which is spending all its efforts to control the people. And inevitably, if only the world will stop supporting Soviet Union or helping Soviet Union, inevitably it will be tired. It will run out of energy. Okay, this image, if the soldier is keeping gun in front of the prisoner, 24 hours a day, day after day, at some moment his muscles will become weaker. And at some moment the gun will go down. At that moment the prisoner will run away. That's what will happen with the Soviet Union, was writing Andrei Amalrik in 1969. A year before, Andrei Sakharov, who was #1 scientist in the Soviet Union, decided that he cannot be silent anymore and wrote his letter to Soviet leaders, and there he wrote that we Soviet Union will not be able to continue to compete with the free world. Well, he didn't call it, of course, free world, but with the capitalists, because there will be if there is no freedom of thought, there will be no free modern advanced science. And that was #1 science this in the country road. Of course, he lost all his status, became dissident, but that was something which was so clear that Soviet Union will not be able, with the time will be less and less competitive on one hand, and on the other hand, it will have to spend more and more energy to control its own people. And that's why this regime is very weak from inside. It will be doomed if only you people in the West will stop supporting it, will stop giving him this energy, will stop treating him as equal. Each of us dissidents knew that Amarik and Sakharov is right. Why? Because we had our own experience. I was loyal Soviet citizen. In order that you'll understand what means loyal Soviet citizen, I can tell you, I know exactly the day when I became loyal Soviet citizen. I was 5 years old. Stalin died. I come home. My father, making sure that neighbors don't hear, because we lived in the communal apartment, 3-4 families together, explains to me that Stalin was an awful man. He killed a lot of people. We Jews were now in a very big danger, but he died, and I should remember all my life, miracle happened. We are saved because he died. He said, but don't tell it to anybody. Do what everybody does. And next day, I go to kindergarten, and I cry together with all the children. I sing songs, how grateful we are to this son of all the people in the world, Stalin, who gave us such happy childhood. And I remember that miracle happened, Stalin died, I should be happy. That's typical state of mind of loyal Soviet citizen, with which you live then all your life. You know, there is one life, official, when you say what you're supposed to say, when you read what you're permitted to read, when you vote the way you're told to vote, when you speak on the meetings of solidarity with one or another fascist regime and praising your beloved leadership. But you know that all this is nonsense. The real life is the family for very few people with whom you can be open. And nobody thinks even to fight for freedom, because the only value in life without identity and without freedom, is survival. How to survive? When I stopped being a loyal Soviet citizen, when after 1967, I, as many other Jews, started reading about your own history. And suddenly you discover that you have history, that you have people, that you have country, and you want to be part of all this. And that's when you find identity, which you find values in your life, and then you have strength to fight for your freedom, for freedom of other Jews, and for freedom of many non-Jews. Just now here, somebody came to me and said that he was one of the first Pentecostals who left Soviet Union. I'm very proud, among the many other things, that I was also fighting for the right of Pentecostals to have their faith and to immigrate. It was all came from the fact that we rediscovered our identity and wanted to be free. So the moment you, for the first time, cross this line of loyal Soviet citizen and start speaking your mind freely, it's a big relief. It's such a liberating feeling. You understand that all the life before was the life of slave, and you don't want it. You don't want to go back to this. So we knew very well, each of the dissidents knew very well how powerful this feeling of liberation, of freedom, of speaking freely your mind is. And that, of course, people are afraid now. But if only the threshold of fear will be a little bit lower, many people will start speaking their mind. So we felt very deeply that it is weak regime, and if only challenged, it will fall apart very quickly. So here we are, dissidents who believe that it is a very weak regime which will fall apart. The state regime which is very aggressive and is warning the world, better treat me well. And the leaders of the free world who looking on us, who looking on them and say, look, you're such nice guys. We love you, we don't love them. But how many armies you have? How many soldiers you have? And soldiers are there. And that is great power which is going to stay, and we have to live with this. And that was the reason for our despair. And after Nixon was Carter, by the way, in the beginning, great hero was, because he was speaking human rights. In his campaign, he put human rights on the top of the agenda. we felt immediately how American diplomats were ready to communicate with us directly. We thought really new times came. But then Soviets started arresting us, and nothing happened. And it was, again, realpolitik again became part of the diplomacy. And then I was already in prison when another president came, Reagan. We didn't know much. We didn't have much hopes what this guy from Hollywood can do. Well, really? So, well, he'll continue this Hollywood performance. And here, now I'm taking you back to that day in prison. We are reading here, and we see that here is not another dissident, the leader of the free world who understands that communism is ridiculously weak. As he said in one of his speeches, we will simply transcend it. It will simply disappear in the dustbin of history, something like this, he said. There were some quotes in that article. So you understand that here is the leader of the free world understands that this regime, which looks so big, so powerful, in fact, it is the regime which is weak from inside, and that it has to be challenged. And if really he is serious in his words, we thought, the days of the Soviet Union will be counted. 3 years after, I was the first political prisoner released by Gorbachev, and I came to White House, and I'm meeting with President Reagan, and I'm telling him about that great day in prison. And he listens to me, and then he says, guys, come here. No, can you repeat it again? You remember what you were telling me about that evil empire speech? So I understood that he had many problems. And then he tells me, and by the way, there was, I heard a great joke. And he tells me, Kosygin and Brezhnev, it's number one and number two in Soviet Union those days, are sitting together, and one says to the other, maybe we will open the gates for Soviet Jews, we have so many problems with them. And the other says, no, but then only two of us will stay. And then the first say, speak for yourself. So, and he tells, and the people around him, Bush, Schultz, and others are laughing. And I'm a little bit upset. I came to speak to the leader of the free world about the great, grand design of the new world, how to continue the struggle for destroying the Iron Curtain. And he's telling all jokes, these jokes we were telling to one another 25 years ago. But then, look, and then he says to his colleagues, but you understand, that's what Soviet people are telling to one another. I recommend you, there is on the internet today, there is such a powerful thing. Internet, you can find Reagan says jokes about communism. And then to have different speeches. You see, I noticed almost each time when he says it to the audience, he says, and you have to understand that's what Soviet people are telling to one another. Why is it so important? We had such a big problem to convince the free world that Soviet people are not loyal to this regime. That is, they are simply double thinkers. They are like me in the age of 5. They believe that it's a miracle that Stalin died, but they have to cry. So that's what they're doing. But in fact, their real opinion is in these jokes. And so President Reagan, first of all, with these jokes, he was bringing very powerful message in a very simple way. But he was reminding to himself what really Soviet people think. And that was very important. You know, when he made the speech, Evil Empire speech, it was just the time of big struggle for Persians in Europe. If you remember, it was American missiles to deter Soviet power. And there were huge demonstrations all over Europe of peace movement, that we want real peace, we don't want war, take your missiles out of Europe. And all these demonstrations, they were Soviet peace activists who were going hand in hand with English and French and Italian and other peace activists, and were demanded to take all these missiles out of Europe. At that very time, we are sitting in prison, and the guy who dared to demand to take Soviet missiles from Europe back to Soviet Union is sitting with us in prison, because he is a real peace activist. Those who are marching there, they are demanded to take American missiles from Europe. And those days, I didn't know it, but I found it in Google. President Reagan, on one of the meetings, is telling to the audience a joke. again, old joke, which when I was 5 years old, I heard this joke, that American and Russian soldiers are debating whether you have more freedom. An American says, I can go in front of the White House and shout, whatever, how it is in English, against the President of the United States. And the Russian soldier says, I also can go straight to Kremlin and shout against the President of the United States. So I have to say, again, old joke, because we told it when we were children to one another. But what is interesting, at the time when Europe is flooded with these demonstrations, when these peace activists from Russia and so many sentimental, naive Europeans are crying, embracing them, and some good Americans are coming to embrace them, we all are for peace. But they are not real. These are people in the West, really, they are those who want peace. Maybe in a naive way, but they want peace. People who came from Russia, they are sent and they have to demonstrate their loyalty because all their future career depends how they demonstrate their loyalty. But what they really think, that's exactly President Reagan hears in these jokes. And he's right. He's right, because the people, the real peace activists who say we want Soviet troops out of Europe, they sit together with us in prison. So this belief of President Reagan in this nature of the people who want to be free helped him to overcome all this realpolitik, all this detente approach, all this retreat under the pressure of dictators. And he challenged them. And then there was Star Wars. Again, there was such a big criticism. Star Wars, there was no technological base. It's all from some fantastic books. It doesn't matter. I don't know to this day how serious, from a scientific point of view, the Star Wars is. In political terms, it meant that Soviet Union, just at the time when it cannot get trade benefits from the United States of America, it cannot get agreements to stop arms race from the United States of America. It has to spend more and more and more energy to keep their own people under control. And America says to this aging Soviet Union, and now we will run another 42 miles of marathon. Now let's run. And Soviet Union doesn't have any power to run. So that's exactly what happened with the Soviet Union. When Gorbachev came to power, he understood that we cannot continue running. He said a phrase which was impossible. He said, look, if we want communism to survive and to win, then he was still speaking in competition with capitalism, we have to start decreasing the pressure on our own people. And what he did, exactly as Andrei Malrik was describing, he started bringing this gun down. At the moment he only started bringing it down, the prisoner ran away. And all these attempts of three-generation attempts to deprive people of their identity, of their property, of their nationality, of their faith, of their family, they disappeared. People immediately ran away back to their families, to their faith, to their religion, to their nationality. They went to their normal station, and Soviet Union fell apart. And that's how the faith of President of the United States of America in the freedom, in the fact that people are created to be free, and that when they have an opportunity to choose between to live under fear or to live free, they will live free, even if all Sovietologists in the world are telling you that it's wrong. He knew that he's right, and he was right. And one more episode in the end, because I think we're already far behind the schedule. 1 more minute. In 1987, President Gorbachev had to come for the first time to the United States of America. And I'm already 1 year after release, but we are in the middle of the struggle because Iron Curtain is strong and Jewish immigration is not moving. And Gorbachev made some gestures, released some prisoners, but he's also afraid to to do more, and maybe doesn't want. And I came to the United States of America, and I called the American Jews that when Gorbachev comes, hundreds of thousands of American Jews will come to Washington to demand the release of Soviet Jewry. And there was a lot of enthusiasm in the grassroots, and many people wanted it, but among the leaders was some reservations. And one of them was, look, we Jews cannot impose our agenda on all our nation. We are part of American nation. And the American nation loves Gorbachev. American nation now wants peace. Gorbachev was a big friend of Reagan. And he comes for the first time with this visit. There are such high expectations. And we will come to insult him with hundreds of thousands. We will put ourselves against our president. We should not do it. Well, not everybody, but some very influential people say, when there will other arguments, whether we'll have enough people, whether people want that, we could deal with this, because I went to 30 different communities, everybody wanted to be on demonstration. But with this argument, what I can tell, I'm not an American citizen. I don't want to make the life of my of American Jews more difficult. So I decided I'll go to Reagan. I'll ask him. So I was in America with my wife Avital, and that was a pretext because President Reagan met a number of times my wife Avital and was really very involved in the struggle for my release. He met me a number of times. He never met us together, so the pretext was that we want to say thank you. So he met us, and it was already the end of his presidency, relatively. And more and more often it was mentioned that he is confusing dates and names and so on. He looked at us as a really proud grandfather, because he really felt that he had something to do with the fact that we are together, and it was very nice. And he tells me that he just a few days ago had a telephone conversation with foreign minister. If you remember, foreign minister of Soviet Union was Shevardnadze. And he tells me and my wife, he says, "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Shevardnadze, I just had a conversation with Soviet Foreign Minister Sharansky. And I told him, you have to let Soviet Jews go." So people around him are a little bit embarrassed. He confused Sharansky and Shevardnadze. I straight go directly to my main topic. After all, if I wasn't Russian, I probably also will confuse Shevardnadze, Sharansky, such difficult names. It doesn't matter for me. I go straight and I say, "Dear Mr. President, soon you'll speak not only to the foreign minister, but to Soviet president, your friend Gorbachev is coming. And I want you to know that we, together with many American Jews, are going to demonstrate. And I'm trying to find words, because I don't want to ask him permission, and if he will not permit, so I'm going to do it anyway. But, and also, why should I ask his permission? We are in a free country. But on the other hand, I do want to have something that I can tell to the other American Jewish leaders, you don't have to be afraid. So, and I said to him, I hope you understand that it's not against your attempts to improve religion. He stops me in the middle of the phrase. He says, "What? You think I am interested in this friendship while he's keeping people in prison? You do everything what you have to do, and I'll do what I have to do." So I came then to American Jewish leaders and said, "See, President Reagan wants us to have this demonstration." And it was a great demonstration. Everybody was very happy. President Reagan used it to say to Gorbachev, "You see, my people will never permit me to ignore this topic." Today in history, it is viewed as the last big battle of Soviet Jewry movement for opening the gate. So it was a great success. But I wondered why I'm telling this episode. Since then, I myself was for 9 years in politics. As I always say, 9 years in prison, 9 years in government. So I met many politicians, and I know how important for their political career, both in Israel and in America, to remember everything, not to confuse any name. Usually, good politician knows hundreds and hundreds of names of the members of the Central Committee, and of their wives, and their birthdays, and when it's bar mitzvah of their children. He or she have to know it in order to be a successful politician. They remember it very well. But when it comes to the questions of good and evil, good and bad, what is right and wrong, it's so complicated on one hand, on the other hand, and then you don't understand what this person wants. President Reagan, already in the end of his career, when he can confuse the name of the country or the name of the date, but when it comes to what is right and wrong, he was sharp, clear, straight. Do what you have to do to make people free, and I'll do what I have to do. Great message. Thank you.
I guess it sounds like you can hear me here. Natan, thank you very much. When we decided to join hands with the Presidential Foundation to celebrate the influence of Reagan's faith, one of the first names that we thought about was Natan Sharansky, and now you can see why we built this around his schedule so he could be here with us. There are a number of questions that people have submitted on cards, and in the time that we have here, I'll try to do my best to rifle through them here. There are a number of them that I think cluster together that you might imagine relate to your neighbors in Israel. Regarding Arab states, some questions mention one of the states in particular. I'm going to try to summarize by saying what is your perspective on the so-called Arab Spring and its implications for Israel? And there are some subparts to that question, but I think I'll just leave it in a general way.
Well, as to Arab Spring, for a moment I felt myself again dissident, but this time in my own country, because everybody was, not everybody, most of our people were very pessimistic about Arab Spring, and I was very optimistic. But I have to say, I think the voices of alarm are right voices. We have all the reasons to be alarmed. But we should not confuse the phenomena itself with the possible developments. What happened now in the Middle East, it had to happen sooner or later, because for 100 years, the leaders of free world have like unsigned silent agreement with the dictators in the Middle East. We will support your dictatorship as long as you are giving us stability. That, in fact, was policy of the free world from the time of Lawrence Arabia in the beginning of the 20th century, that the free world is busy finding dictator who will, whether it is in Saudi Arabia, whether it's in Jordan, whether it is in Libya, whether it is in Egypt or in any other country, or in Palestinian Authority, and this dictator has to deliver us stability. Sooner or later, it had to explode, because people will not agree to live forever under the fear. And when I'm told, but that is different mentality, there's a, simply look what these people who were participating in these revolutions or demonstrations or revolts, what they were saying themselves. You can Google speaking freely your mind and then Egypt or Saudi or Libya, and you'll find suddenly thousands of testimonies of people who went on these demonstrations. They went on these demonstrations in Egypt and in Tunis and in Libya and today in Syria, not because they hate America or love America, not because they hate Israel or love Israel, not because they hate Islam or love Islam. They went because they don't want to continue living in constant fear that if they say something wrong, they or not approved, they will be punished. So sooner or later it had to happen. I was among those who 10 years ago was writing that it will happen, 5 years ago and so on. The choice always was, the longer we keep these dictatorships at power, the free world is supporting them, the more the chance that Muslim brothers will come to power. That's what Saadettin Ibrahim, Egyptian democratic dissident, said to President Bush when we organized a meeting of democratic dissidents in 2007 with President Bush in Prague. I was one of the two organizers of it. And he said, why you're supporting Mubarak? And you have to say that President Bush forced Mubarak to release Saadettin Ibrahim. So Saadettin Ibrahim thanks him for this. But he says, but why are you supporting Mubarak? And President Bush says, we have no choice. If it will not be Mubarak, it will be Muslim Brothers. And he says to him, that is your mistake. If the only choice which we have, Muslim Brothers or Mubarak, in the end it will be Muslim Brothers. And the longer it continues, the bigger the chance of Muslim Brothers. So it had to happen anyway. And so if it had to happen, so the sooner the better. The problem is that when it happens, first of all, it takes to the free world such a long time to overcome realpolitik and to start calling Assad not a reformer but dictator, and the same with practically every other. But then when it happens, the only two organized forces are Muslim Brothers and army, but there are suddenly thousands, maybe millions of non-organized, people who want simply free society. That is the time for the free world to be very active. You continue to give $2 billion to Egypt. To whom you're giving it? To the army. Where are all these NGOs who are speaking about the rights of women and the rights of students and the rights of trade unions? Where are universities with their joint programs? That is the time to start to try to say to those many people who want more democracy that you are our allies and our partners. The free world is sitting on the fence, and the longer the free world is sitting on the fence, the more the chance that army and Muslim Brothers will bring us new set of dictators, and free world will say, okay, now you will be our partners. So on one hand, I'm optimistic that finally it happened. On the other hand, I'm very concerned that if free world will not demonstrate leadership the type that Reagan was demonstrating, we are in danger. Okay.
You probably have already answered another kind of a subtopic to this and that is, one of the questions was, how do you explain that as the Arabs are gaining freedom, they are tending to distance themselves more from Israel? And maybe you've already addressed that sufficiently.
Yeah, well, look, again, it's, if you look now at Egypt and you see this crowd which was burning Israeli embassy, and then many of the leaders of the demonstration which brought down Mubarak immediately said that it's really against everything that we were fighting for. So it's not that all the Arabs, it's one big mass. It's true that today in Egypt, Muslim Brothers have influence on 30% of the population. If Mubarak was removed 10 years ago, I think Muslim Brothers had influence on 5% of the population. So the thing is that the other 70%, they are not organized in any force. They have a lot of goodwill. They had a lot of energy. They organized themselves through Facebook. It wasn't American NGOs which helped them to organize. It was Facebook that helped them to organize. Now, at this moment, they are passive because they did what they could do, and now they don't have sources, financial or spiritual, or any other sources of support. So it is a difficult situation. But at least it's a situation with a lot of opportunities, which didn't exist only 1 year ago. Again, I call everybody who has any influence on the policy of American government to make sure that that is the time for American leaders to act.
Very good. Maybe a tougher question and more specific. In that Iran may be close to developing a nuclear weapon, this person asks very bluntly, what is Israel's potential for deterring an attack?
Well,
I don't mean to put you on the spot at the time.
Look, I happened to be, when I was in the first Netanyahu's government minister, I came to Russia during my first trip to Russia, in addition to an official mission with special secret mission, to deliver them a message that we know about the leakage of Russian technologies to Iran, and if they will not stop it, it was 97, in 10 years maximum, Iran will have both nuclear weapons and missile. And when Russians denied, we gave them, I was permitted to give them a little bit piece of information which showed that we know about it. And so they accepted, they promised to take some steps and so on. Well, they were not very cooperative on it. But one thing, unfortunately, Putin was right when he told me, you'll see one day when it will become everything open, the major technologies which Iran is getting, it's not from us. And really today we know that nuclear weapons which is developed, mainly these technologies we got from Europe. But what I want to say that then we knew for sure that in 10 years, what means to 2007, they'll have everything. Now we are 2011, they don't. It didn't happen by itself. There were many different postponements. They didn't happen by themselves, these postponements. So there are ways to slow down these problems. Nevertheless, if the world will not be ready to stop them, Israel will have to do it. Okay? But by the way, I continue to be a big believer that the best way to neutralize this is changing of regime. And I think there was unique opportunity for changing regime a year and a half ago. And I think it was big failure of United States of America that United States of America was not with the dissidents, not with the dissidents, with the people of Iran when they were on barricades. And then, and that is one of the most sad examples of the policy about which I was speaking in my speech, when accommodation and engagement and detente becomes more important than helping the people who want their freedom.
Thank you very much. Here's one, a little change of pace, Natan. How has your involvement in Judaism changed or grown since you're being free to observe as you choose? Yeah. Can you speak more personally of your faith in those two different situations?
Well, look, first of all, I'll tell you frankly, the best place to speak to God directly is prison, by far. The best. So, in fact, I discovered my identity as through history, through culture, through Zionism, and only then in the end through Judaism, but that was in prison. It was a very powerful experience. In fact, it's to make a very long story very short, is that a few days before my arrest, I received from my wife psalm book, Tehillim, small psalm book, and she wrote that for a long time she was traveling with this book, and she has a feeling that the time has come to send it to me. I got it through tourists. And some days after this, I put it aside. I didn't have time I was too in the politics and struggle, and I was a spokesman of our movement. My friends were arrested. I didn't have time for the sentimental things. I put it aside. And then I was arrested, and then I remembered about it, and for 3 years I was fighting to get back this psalm book. It was confiscated, of course, with all the other things. And then they brought it to me 3 years later in prison, together with the telegram that my father died. So I decided that what I can do, I'll be reading in memory of my father psalm book until I start understanding. It took me a lot of time to understand, because for you it's easier. You're reading it psalm in English, but when you know Hebrew, 1,000 words, maybe mainly political demonstration, whatever, and here it is the ancient Hebrew, and there are no periods, because if you are not trained specially in yeshiva, you don't understand where is the end of the sentence or the beginning. You can't really understand it. So, but because I was a mathematician, so I decided to make parallels. Here is a word, here is a word. like puzzles. And it so happened that the first phrase which I understood fully, which exists, was from 10 very short Hebrew words, was Gam ki elech b'geit tzalma'at, the 23rd Psalm, and when I go through the valley of death, I fear no evil because you are with me. That was the first phrase which I understood fully. And for me it was clear that that is the message which my wife, which King David, which God are sending to me to prison. And from there started my religious experience. It is much more difficult to keep this as vibrant when you are in the government, when you are in daily life, when you are making compromise. But what is good that then we have children, and we want our children to continue this path. So, and my wife, who while I was in prison became very observant, so I said, okay, you take care of the education of our children. And now whenever my wife says, well, but you know, today is Shabbat and you didn't go to synagogue, I say, our children went to synagogue, yeah. Their spouses went to synagogue, yes. Now, already for a year, our grandchildren go. So what do you want? You made sure that our tradition goes there.
Thank you very much for sharing that. You know, you mentioned that passage from the 23rd Psalm, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. That happens to be emblazoned or printed into the stone in the walkway at Pepperdine in what we call the Heroes Garden. Sometime you must visit our campus and see the Heroes Garden. And one of the things you mentioned in your comments, in my a dozen or so trips to Russia all across all 11 time zones, I felt the thing that really connected so perfectly was Russian and American humor. Much more than my friends in France or Germany or Switzerland. I'm not sure there is humor in some of those places, but the humor, even on Sakhalin Island, the governor of Sakhalin Island captured reality for me and with the humor. And we do have a statement in English that there's no such thing as an atheist in a foxhole. So when you talked about finding God in prison, it reminded me of that. We have time for one more question. What comment would you make about the difference in Russia today? I know that's a whole encyclopedia, but how would you sum up the situation with the Putin government? And I even have one question in here that says, is that Putin connected with, a Russian mafia here in America and all sorts of things. But how would you sum up, without getting into that, how would you sum up the situation in Russia today?
Yeah, as to whether Putin is connected to Russian mafia, probably people, when I was accused to be a spy, American government, Carter and later Reagan denied it. But probably some Americans still think that I'm connected to intelligence services if they're asking me whether Putin is connected to them. Of course, I don't know. I don't think that, but no doubt that there is a big retreat in Russia in terms of democratic institutions were not built, and they stopped building them. And that's the result, the freedom which was got by Soviet people was never materialized into stable, permanent, strong institutions. And no doubt that today connection between power and business structures is very close. You don't have to call it mafia. Simply, it's the way of life. I have to say, with all this criticism, in terms of what's happening with democracy in Russia, there are some things which are not changed to the worse. For example, Putin promised that he will not be undermining the position of religion, and that he will not stop Jewish communities from building their Jewish life. I have to say, each time when some local authorities are trying to create problems for Jewish community, if it doesn't help, we go to Kremlin, and Kremlin always. There is no gulag, there is no tens of thousands of political prisoners. Unfortunately, there are political prisoners, and Khodorkovsky is one of them. There are no 5 million people working for KGB as informers, which were. So when people say, oh, it's, again, like that old Russia, it's not that old Russia, then people were controlled by fear or were being killed and exiled. It's doesn't there. But no doubt that from real democracy, from transparency, from separation of courts from executive or business from legislative, it's very far from what we would like to see.
Thank you very much for that. And may I maybe conclude, there is one question that I will answer. If someone here has a prisoner of conscience bracelet from the 1970s with your name on it, would you like to have it? And how can I get it to you? And I would suggest that whoever this person is, Mr. Sharansky has another commitment, and we must ask everyone to stay seated briefly while we exit in a moment here. But there are people who work here at the Presidential Library, and some of my staff will be at the doors. If you're that person, I think you should feel free to let yourself be known, and we'll see that that it gets to you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, look, there were many people who went with these bracelets, and I felt their support. So,
well, we appreciate deeply the hospitality of the Reagan Foundation, Stuart, to you and your family and to your faculty. I'm the dean of the school. He doesn't have faculty. You're fortunate. Pardon me, Bob. Thank you for your hospitality and your invitation to be here. And particularly, thank you to Mr. Sharansky for this very inspiring, educational, enlightening, and encouraging and hopeful evening that we've been able to spend with him this evening. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll continue.